All right. Good morning, everyone. Today's date is October 27th. It's a Tuesday. And we are now going to start talking about what happens when the United States starts extending their population into present day Minnesota before it becomes the state. And in order to do that, we've kind of set the stage, right? Louisiana Purchase means that we're buying the territory. And then now we need to explore the territory, which Zebulon Pike did yesterday. And now we're starting to talk about the last piece that allows that to happen. And unfortunately, I'm going to just be honest, it's the worst of the three, right? And it's because there already was a group of people living there at the time of Louisiana Purchase, actually, many groups of people. And unfortunately, they are going to be in the way, or they're going to be an obstacle to America doing what they really want to do, which is extend into this territory, and that's the Native Americans. So we're going to talk about the treaty system and how that eventually will give almost all of what we know today as Minnesota to the United States government over a period of about 100 years. Okay. So on filming this video, I am on a losing streak right now. I've had my computer crash once today, and I've had my dog bark in 2 other takes. So hopefully I'll be done with my losing streak here, but who knows? Anything could happen. So if my dog barks again, I apologize. So just really quickly, I'm going to go into screen sharing, and we're going to take a quick look at Google Classroom for today. And obviously, make sure that you're doing the warm-ups before you even get into lesson content, okay? It's just so much easier that way, and it gives you an opportunity to try new things. And remember, as long as you follow the directions, you're getting 100% no matter what. There really isn't anything that benefits you by doing the warm-up afterwards. So today's is a discussion question, and it's asking you to tell me what you would think if the school banned YouTube entirely, and why would it be important if they decided to do that to put it in writing? And I think that's a great segue in what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to hop in between this first part here on this Prezi presentation. You're not going to have to take notes on it, but it is going to help us kind of understand what we're going to talk about. And then we're going to switch over to our normal PowerPoint, and that's what you're going to be taking the videos on, or excuse me, the notes on, taking the videos on. Come on, Mr. Plog. Yikes. All right, so probably should have reset this, but so this Prezi was actually made when this was the only thing that was taught in 6th grade. We modified 1 unit out of an entire textbook that we used to teach for an entire year. So that's why it says chapter 6, the land changes hands. We are not in 6 chapters, obviously, of doing this unit. So as you can see here, we actually have a picture, and we'll see this later on. This is an agreement reached between Chief Shakopee, which a lot of you have probably heard the name of that town around here. It's named after this person, of the Dakota. And I believe at the time that is our soon to be first governor of Minnesota, Henry Sibley. Now, this agreement basically is going to relocate the Dakota Nation permanently after 1851. It's a very famous treaty. And they agreed to move, and there's really a reason for that. But in a lot of cases, these agreements end up being taken completely out of context. And I do want you to think about this. So when Native Americans would make an alliance, make friends, end a war, anything, they would usually have conferences where oral agreements were struck. An oral agreement is basically saying, hey, you good, bro? We good? Shake hands, and that's it. That's a binding agreement. There was no written language at the time. So that was how they settled matters. They also had another way. They would formalize it by making these artifacts that they would have as decoration to remember the agreement. And these were called wampum belts. And we'll get back to these in a second. But this right here actually is an agreement between 5 Native American nations to join a confederacy for when they went to war so that they would be powerful amongst the other nations that they would fight with. And that is known as the Iroquois nation, right? Or the Iroquois Confederacy. We talked about that earlier on with the fur trade. And those 5 spots here on this wampum belt, they recognize all 5 of those nations working together, right? As you can see, each one represents a specific one. It's the same thing that we see with this wampum belt here. Clearly, 2 people holding hands. This obviously has to do with some sort of friendship or alliance, right? So they're going to be decorated in a way that it will visually help you remember what those agreements were. Now, going back, why is it important to have things written down? Well, unfortunately, because the Native Americans didn't have a written language, the United States government would write down agreements that they would make with them, and they could change basically anything that they wanted to because the Native Americans did not write the language, and many of them didn't even speak it, right? So unfortunately, you've got a one-sided agreement where somebody's saying one thing and has it written down, and then the other one doesn't. And unfortunately, they're going to defer to those that have it written down, even if they're lying, right? And that's the problem that we have with these treaties. So what is a treaty? Well, we're going to move over to that PowerPoint now. Remember, a really good idea. I'll do this at first, but then I have to go full screen. Remember, it's a really, really good idea to get into the habit of doing that split screen, right? So you can get your exit ticket pulled out right here and then have my video playing where I have my PowerPoint right now, right? Saving some time. So what is a treaty? It's not a snack. It does sound like it though. Like even I was kind of worried when I first brought it up. I thought my dog would start running around thinking I was going to give her a treat. Hopefully that I don't hear it coming so good. Okay, but a treaty is not a snack. It is an agreement, and it's between 2 or more groups, and it's supposed to be permanent. Once it's agreed upon, it stays that way forever unless there's another treaty that ends up making a different agreement. Now, usually they are done to avoid war and conflict or to end it, and we see that a lot. Especially at this time period, Europe was fighting each other a lot. In a lot of cases, these wars would all be end with treaties. Now, in the case of the United States and the Dakota, and other nations, I think that definitely was something that was thought about, but really it was made, at least from the United States perspective, to keep peace. And when they would make these treaties and they would get these lands from the Dakota or from the Ojibwe, they would pay off what was called annuities. And those are just yearly payments. They're yearly installments. Now, the Dakota and the Ojibwe would usually agree to that because they wanted to have money because the United States was becoming really the only people they could trade with. The problem is that the annuities needed to be paid on time. And as we're going to see later on when we talk about the U.S.-Dakota War, they didn't always come in as promised. They either came in a lot of times late, or sometimes they would come in way, way less money than the United States originally promised. And during the Civil War, that's going to definitely become a problem because money was tight. So this right here, I think this is a great quote. I understand what you want, and I have heard you speak. You want land. So the United States would hold these meetings and they would give all of these great reasons that the Ojibwe or the Dakota should give these lands to them. But really, it's just them wanting land, being greedy, and finding a way to do a sales pitch on it. So wampum belt. This is part of your notes. We talked about this already, right? But it's a decorative item made by Native Americans to show or remember a past agreement or friendship, right? So this is the one from the Iroquois Nation. We'll move on past that because we've already talked about it. So the treaty making, what happened? So we start out in 1805. First land treaty between U.S. and American Indian group in what we call Minnesota. Zebulon Pike did this, right? He bought the land and then made it into Fort Snelling, or at least it would be made later into Fort Snelling. That was the very first one. Second one is called the Treaty of Prairie du Chien, and that is in 1825. This was a peace treaty. Native American nations were fighting each other, and the United States got involved. The problem is that even though we have this wonderful map over here that shows these distinct areas,
the real borders between these areas were not so clear, right? And because of that, there were lots of disputes between natives as to whose land belongs to who, and they got into some arguments. The United States decides, hey, we're going to come in as a peacemaker, and we are going to make lines that definitively say who has what land. Now, sounds great. But what the United States was really trying to do is to define it so that later on, when they wanted to take them in treaties, it would be very easy for them to do that because they would only deal with one nation as opposed to like 2 or 3 claiming the same land. So there definitely was some trickery there. Now, the land cession of 1837 is the last one we're going to talk about on this slide. Right here, it's actually a agreement between both the Dakota and Ojibwe. And a lot of that is going to be in Wisconsin, as we can see here. But there is some of it that ends up extending into Minnesota. And one of the important waterways or landforms that Minnesota the United States gets is Mille Lacs Lake or Thousand Lakes Lake, which we've talked about before, right? So just this right here, I wanted to show you, this is the land in Minnesota that ends up being given to the United States from the Ojibwe and the Dakota in that 1837 land cession. There really isn't any name that they gave that treaty, and I don't really know why, but they didn't. Okay, 1851, there's 2 of them. Probably the most important, especially when we talk about the Dakota War later on. One is going to be the Traverse des Sioux, which means the movement or the travels of the Sioux. So basically, as you can see here, the Dakota are taken and they are put onto this little white strip of land, which is on what is known today as the Minnesota River. And they were originally in all of that red area there. So they took about 80 to 90% of what they had lived on before and gave them that narrow strip for annuity payments. Of course, 11 years later, when the United States is in the middle of the Civil War, money's hard to come by, and these payments do not come in as promised, and it really, really escalates into an issue. And that's what ends up resulting in the U.S.-Dakota War. The Treaty of Mendota did a similar thing, but really, if you take a look at it, this is the best way to describe it, right? Is you've got 80% of your land is just taken away from you and you're forced to live on this little narrow strip. Not to mention, a lot of these bands were put together on the Minnesota and they weren't necessarily the same culture, right? There were 7 council fires and now they're all put into this one area. So it's going to make things rather difficult. And in some cases, it caused conflict. Eventually what's going to end up happening is this is what's called a reservation, right? And that's a word that we've probably heard before. There are Native American reservations all over the United States. In fact, I grew up right next to one. And we like to think of them as Americans as places that allows Native Americans to keep their culture. But in reality, really, those reservations were made by the United States in an attempt to give them a small chunk of land, but really take the rest of it. So it is a very, very difficult portion of history and one that is often whitewashed because it does make European Americans look not so good. So this right here is an agreement. This is actually the Traverse des Sioux. So we showed that picture earlier of Chief Shakopee. This is the same picture. It's just more of a firsthand account of it. That other one was redone later on. But you can still see this is Henry Sibley right here and Alexander Ramsey making an agreement with Chief Shakopee. And for annuity payments, they would be moved on to this narrow strip on the Minnesota. Okay. So around the 1840s, the United States comes up with this great idea. And by great, I mean they think it's a grand idea, but really it's going to be not so good for the people who already live there. It's called Manifest Destiny. It's the idea that the United States needed to expand, right? Especially into this Louisiana territory. For decades after they bought it, not many people had moved out here. And the United States people back in the East were really pushing to try to get their own lands. And it starts with the willingness or the idea that the United States should take Texas from what was then Mexico. And they are successful in that. And so what happens is that people start coming up with all these projects to expand. Now, this picture is a great illustration of what this idea is, and it shows both the positives and the negatives of it. So you see back here to the well, to the right, but I think we can think of it as the east, right? You see this light area with all of these great, and I'm using this in quotes right now, advancements that European Americans had, the railroad, plows, carriages, covered wagons, and they're heading off to the west, which is dark, and it has all of these things that people were afraid of at the time. I think the darkness is supposed to illustrate the unknown, right? But I really think that a hidden message here is that the darkness is almost like evil. And as this woman is moving, she's brightening up the path. Like European Americans are brightening up the nation as they're moving to the west. Oh, it's my laundry. Whoops. So as they're moving out to the west, they're brightening up the area, the darkness, the unknown. And I think that it's a very hidden way of saying that European Americans are going to make the continent better by expanding, but they are not making it better for the Native Americans, the bison herds that you see here, or the other wildlife that they're going to come into contact with, right? So this manifest destiny, this extending of the United States really is at the detriment of all of those other people, groups, animals, everything else, but we don't think of it that way. And it's definitely something that we call propaganda, or something that the United States is really trying to promote and kind of whitewash or silence anybody else that was a detractor of it. So, oh, cool, it worked. Shoot. So I just really quickly want to show you like what it actually looked like. So I found that image that we see there. It is really cool. But I found this interactive image that shows the United States expanding over time. So this would have been at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, just moving outward, right? And we started talking around 1805 is when Zebulon Pike takes his journey. This right here is manifest destiny working on its own, right? We can see it. So every year, look at the difference in population density just per year, starting in about 1820. And I think really it has a lot to do with the railroads being built. But look at this. Now we've got out in California, people are coming out there. Oregon Trail up here. This is the Mormons moving out to Utah, actually. And we can see it, especially once the Transcontinental Railroad gets built and finished in the 1870s. That's when it really takes off, right? And this idea of manifest destiny just continues to be promoted and used so that the United States can expand around the whole continent. Okay, and we're going to stop there at 1900. Otherwise, we could go on, but it's pretty easy to find if you type it in. I just did population density US after 1900 and I found it. So you should be able to find it pretty easily. Okay, that being said, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you were able to take your notes today. Remember that link would have been on there, and just, make a copy. I'll be sure to put that in the instructions, but have yourselves a great night. Make sure that you work on that exit ticket. Let's just take a look at it really quick. Now, if you've been doing this the right way, you should have noticed that most of these exit tickets are coming directly out of your completed notes, right? So as long as you're doing that, you should be in great shape come the exit ticket. And here it is. So 4 questions. I want you to answer 2 through 4 in complete sentences. 1, you can just fill in the blank. Okay. All right, everybody. Have yourselves a good night. And we will see you tomorrow when we really start getting into the idea of white Americans expanding and creating societies out here in present day Minnesota and its path to statehood. All right. Take care. We'll see you tomorrow. Hey, my dog didn't bark.